My name is Joyce Raimondo. I'm the education coordinator at the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center. We're a national landmark in East Hampton, New York. And with me today is Theresa Davis, our wonderful assistant to the director, who also curated our current show, Crosscurrents. And Theresa will be telling you about the exhibition and sharing some of the pieces in the exhibit with you. And after that, I'll take you on the historic tour of the Barn Studio where Pollock and Krasner made their famous abstract expressionist works. So Theresa, can you tell us before we begin, how did the show come about?
Well, this is a selection of paintings and artwork that we have in our permanent collection. So we have a lot more than this, but we have chose 17 pieces for this show.
Mm-hmm. And in general, can you tell us how is it that we obtain works in our permanent collection?
Most of these are gifted from the families who own these or from friends of the family. We'll get to a Zog bomb and I'll tell you who that was actually made for and how it came to us. But mostly gifted to the Pollock-Krasner House.
Okay. And I take it that a lot of the artworks on display are by artists who were friends with Pollock and Lee?
All contemporaries except for Ronnie Stein, who was Lee's nephew. These were all contemporaries. They all knew Jackson and Lee from New York City, from working on the WPA, from moving out here to taking over their apartment when Jackson and Lee moved out here. So they all crossed one another's lives at various times in their relationships.
And if you want to come visit in person, we do hope you come on site. You can go to pkhouse.org to sign up for a tour. And the exhibition is up until July 7th, right?
July 7th.
And then you can see our schedule of other exhibitions for the summer. So keep in mind as we do this walkthrough, when Lee and Pollock lived here, these works were not on display in their house, but we also have works that were in display, and those are the ones that I'll go over after Theresa is done. So we're going to start back here with a piece near the kitchen.
Yeah, so this is by Stanley William Hayter. It's called Japanese Kite. He was a very well-regarded printmaker in Paris in 1927. He started his Atelier 17, his printmaking studio, and he had very well-known artists dropping in this innovative studio of his. For instance, Miro, Chagall, Picasso, Giacometti. They were all learning very innovative printmaking techniques. During the start of the war, he moved Atelier 17 studio to New York City. And while he was in New York City, many American artists dropped in on his studio, namely Pollock, Motherwell, Rothko. And there they were learning really innovative printmaking techniques and exposed to very experimental ideas. So I wanted to start with this one because later on, as we're walking around, you will see 4 other pieces that came out of this Atelier 17 that we also are part of our permanent collection.
And this one is an engraving.
This is an engraving. Next up, we'll go to Newton Hayden's Stubbing. And this was actually one of my first choices that I pulled out of our permanent collection because I love that he uses his hands. He was an artist that was wanting to escape his very conventional English family. He rode his bicycle to Spain and he went through the caves of Altamira. While he was there, he was so moved by the cave paintings and the hand marks that were all over the cave paintings that from that point on, he only used his hands to make paintings. Those are handprints you see right there. And this is untitled. He did this in 61, but he died at a very young age, presumably from poisoning from the ink that he used.
Oh, wow.
But he was taken by the mystery of the primitives and the markings. And I love that because Pollock also was exposed to Native American Indians and imagery. And on some of his murals, he also puts his handprints.
Mhm.
So it tied into Pollock right away for me. And he was moved by the mystery and the primitiveness of hand printing.
Mhm. And Pollock, by the way, also used his hands when he was working with Siqueiros, who was teaching Pollock and other artists during his workshops in New York City how to use unusual methods, but also created parade floats where he had all of the artists put handprints on the floats as up to signify diversity and unity. And perhaps that also inspired Pollock as well. But this is a trajectory in modern art where artists are using their bodies, they're using their hands, they're using unusual materials and tools.
And they're reaching back. They're reaching back to other cultures and other, especially Native Americans or Indigenous people.
This is one of my favorite pieces. It's really, really beautiful.
Yeah, it really comes across well.
Thanks.
We'll move over here to a piece by James Brooks. This is also untitled, 1963. It's ink and watercolor on paper. I love this. It is so joyous. It's just so expressive. James Brooks was a friend of Pollock's and Krasner's. And actually, James Brooks and his soon-to-be wife took over Jackson and Lee's apartment in Greenwich Village when they moved out here to Springs. So once they took over their apartment, Jackson and Lee invited them out here. They eventually bought a house in Montauk. There was a hurricane that destroyed that house, so they became neighbors and bought property on Neck Path. And James Brooks was very influenced by Pollock and his free-form expression, and he started using raw canvas. This is not a canvas, this is paper, but he did start using raw canvas to spread inks on it, so it bled very organically. And this is a little bit of an example of that, but on paper.
Mhm. It's almost like a Rorschach test. It reminds me a little bit.
But most of these artists, as they were contemporaries, also started off doing figurative work. And during the 40s and 50s, they all moved into abstraction. They needed something that went deeper than just a portrait or a still life. They wanted something that spoke to the soul a little bit deeper, spoke to the process of artwork.
Mhm. I like this as a good comparison to the piece that we just saw. Like that one is so heavy, it's so bold, right? It's so black, really, the
Mhm.
marks. And this one, to me, it's more lyrical, it's more delicate. There's more of the white of the papers coming through. That's a nice comparison.
And then we'll move to the front parlor. And we have a number of other pieces on the wall, but we'll go over to this one by Hedda Stern. Hedda Stern was born in Bucharest, and she came to the United States in the early 40s. She came to the United States in the early 40s.
You try to, excuse, I just want to get the whole thing.
Does that matter?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
And she was represented by Peggy Guggenheim at Art of This Century. And this is an example of her doing a caricature of her friend Herman Cherry. Herman Cherry was known to be a bit of a aggressive character. And I think she captured that kind of confrontational aggressiveness very well in this caricature of him.
And for anyone who's watching this on Zoom, at first you might not see the face, which I didn't, but then we see this is an eye, a nose, a beard, a head. It's all in profile.
It really speaks to his own character.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's a caricature, it speaks to his very domineering character.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a caricature of Herman Cherry. And then we'll come over here to a Herman Cherry. I just love Herman Cherry. He was a brilliant colorist. He studied with somebody named Stanton McDonald Wright. And eventually he studied at the Art Students League with Thomas Hart Benton, and Pollock was in his class. So they got to be friends from that point. And they remained friends their whole life. And when Herman Cherry was on Martha's Vineyard, he heard that Pollock had died in a car accident, and he and de Kooning boarded a plane to come back for the funeral. They stopped over at Benton's house and said, please join us. This is what just happened to Pollock. And Benton was so fraught. Herman Cherry and de Kooning boarded a plane and came back to Springs for Jackson's funeral. Benton, it was just too heavy for him because Benton was really like a surrogate father to Jackson Pollock. But I just love Herman Cherry's colors. They're joyful, they're playful, they're light. His work is so worth looking into in a deeper way. I know we're skipping a lot of things here, but we're just going to some key pieces. This one is a Wilfred Zogbaum, and Zogbaum, his parents immigrated from Russia. He ended up being a photographer in World War II. And during the 40s, he decided to move out here. He quit his photography and started focusing on his fine art. And much like Jackson and Lee, he also would walk along the beaches and he would find these incredible spheres, these incredible stones that his friends nicknamed them Zog stones, that he would incorporate into his metal construction. So that's what you're looking at here. This was made for Patia Rosenberg, who was the daughter of Harold Rosenberg. And then this was gifted to us by Zogbaum's son, Rufus.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're looking at here, these are 4 etchings. This was from a project that was carried over from Stanley William Hayter's Atelier 17. When Hayter moved back to Paris in the 50s, Peter Grippy, who was one of the artists that would drop in on his studios, took over Atelier 17 in New York City. And in 51, he conceived this idea to do a collaboration between 21, these are called 21 etchings and poems. So some of these collaborators were Motherwell and Peter Grippy, Yonkers. So there was, what you're seeing are etchings and poems written in the poet's own hands.
And Theresa, I know that there's a glare on some of these objects. Can you tell everybody where they can see these online or any of these works in the show?
Sure. If you wanted to go online, we have the whole show up. And if you go onto our website, pkhouse.org, and click on Crosscurrent Exhibition, and then you'll see the 17 images, and you could click on an image and it will open up to very detailed information about each piece, the year, how it was made, and a little bit more history behind each piece.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And this one is by Lee Krasner. This is a collaboration of her work, her photolithographic work, in combination with Frank O'Hara. He was a curator at MoMA, and when he died at a young age, many artists were invited to do a piece of artwork that collaborated with his poetry. So that is his poetry in the middle of Lee's imagery. This was done in 1967. And that's just a few of the 17 pieces that we have up here in the house. But like I said, you can find that again on our website, pkhouse.org. Click on Crosscurrents, and then you can click on individual images to give you more information.
And one more thing, one of our new acquisitions is a very unusual object in the corner of the room over there.
Oh, yes.
So we're going to go back into the parlor. So when you come here now, you will see this unusual item and probably wonder, what is that doing in the house? So tell us about this one.
So this is not a two-dimensional picture, painting, or etching. This is an Indian costume that Jackson's nephew, Jason McCoy, had wanted when he was about 5 or 6 years old. So his mother, Arloy, was married to Jackson's brother, Sanford, and Arloy made this Indian costume for Jason when he was about 5 or 6, around 1945. And he said his brother Jackson ironed on those green and red appliques and finished off the Indian costume. And this was given to the Pollock-Krasner Foundation in honor of our previous director, Helen Harrison, and her tenure here and her commitment to the Pollock-Krasner House for the past 34 years. And Jason handed this beautifully handmade costume of his to Helen to say thank you for taking such good care of the Pollock-Krasner House. So now we have that in our collection, and it's just amazing that the fabric has remained. It's still a little boy's, nothing is rotting on it. It's still the little costume that his mother made for him in 1945.
And it's very nostalgic of that era, right? What children used to play.
And they were surrounded by Native Americans when they lived in the Southwest. So this is very apropos of what he would have been interested in, because they were all surrounded by Native American Indians.
That's an incredible gift.
Incredible.
Yeah,
Incredible.
that's really valuable gift.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, then let's give Theresa a big round of applause on Zoom. Yay! Zoom round of applause. And I'm so glad everybody came in to see the exhibit and to see another aspect of the Pollock-Krasner House, which a lot of people aren't aware of, that we have this amazing collection. And I take it that this is just the tip of the iceberg.
This is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we really had to pick and choose. And I really went with things that spoke to me personally, like the Herman Sherry with his colors, and the stubbing with his handprints. So I went about choosing things that spoke to me personally, and then found the kind of through thread that connected them all. That's not usually how you put together an exhibition, but that's how I put this one together. And we have 2 exhibitions a year, one in the spring and one in the fall. This is our spring exhibition. And then after July, I think it's July 12th, the next exhibition goes up. So we hope you join us and come here in person to see what we have to offer.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Theresa. I really appreciate it. It's our busy season. We're open now to the public, so I know that you have a lot going on, and we really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for taking the time to go through the exhibition. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, I'll tell you what, everybody. Now, if you'd like to stay on, I'm going to do a little walkthrough with more of a historic tour in general about the house and the studio. So how about this? Let's start in the studio and outdoors because it's such a spectacular day, okay? And for those of you who are new to our virtual program, I'll just give you a little history behind this site. Today, we're a national landmark. This is the house, and back there is the barn studio. This is Acabana Creek. The barn was originally there, and Pollock and his friends moved it here using a forklift. Okay, so where was I? A little bit about the history. ever since the Long Island Railroad could take artists from New York City out to the east end of Long Island, which is about 100 miles east of New York City, artists started to settle here. And I don't think it's surprising. It is so spectacularly beautiful here, but especially the quality of light, because we're surrounded by water, by bays, by oceans. So the light is spectacular. So originally, the Impressionist artists such as Childe Hassam was here, Thomas Moran was here, and many, many other landscape painters. But gradually, there were various waves. The Surrealist artists settled out here. And when the artists in the 1940s and 50s were gathering in New York City, many of those artists, such as de Kooning and Pollock and Lee, moved out here to the East End, okay? So what's so special about the East End and this particular site is this is really the home of abstract expressionism, which grew up in New York City and also right here. Now, what is abstract expressionism? It's different than abstract art that came before it in that it is very physical. It is a release of energy and a release of emotion, and it's swooshing paint and dripping paint and scraping and spraying. So the paint becomes very free, but that's not to say that it was done carelessly. It was done carefully, but also with a sense of a release, right? Energy made visible. Pollock said, I want to express my emotions rather than illustrate them. So now what I'd like to do is walk you through the studio and show you some of the items we have on the actual site. So for starters, I'm going to take off my shoes, so excuse me, and I'm going to put on some little booties because we're going to walk right on the drip painted floor. So these are our little booties we put on. And the barn is basically two rooms. This first room was mainly used for storage. And over here, we have behind glass Lee Krasner's painting cart and her slippers. So many of the objects belong to Lee that you see because Lee painted in here after Pollock's death. Pollock died in 1956. She started to use the studio in 1957, and she died in 1984. When Pollock was alive, she used a room which is upstairs in the house and then later used the garage as well. But so we're looking at Lee Krasner's belongings here. Also over here, we see Lee's paint supplies. These are pigments. You mix them with oil, they turn into paint. We see her mosaic pieces here, these glass sticks. Lee made this beautiful round mosaic table. We also have Lee's apron here. So it's a very, it's almost as if you're visiting them. And that's what's so special about visiting an artist's studio. You get a sense of Pollock and Krasner as real people, not just icons of art, okay? There's a couple of unusual things in here. One is this real skull. This skull, Pollock took this from the Art Students League where he was studying with Thomas Hart Benton. The students used to draw anatomy. So when Pollock and Krasner first started out, they were drawing things you could see, like a portrait, a self-portrait, a landscape, a narrative painting, things like that. Pollock said that Thomas Hart Benton was a strong personality to react against. What did he mean by that? Pollock eventually moved into the realm of imagination, the realm of his inner life, painting things that you can't actually see. He's no longer painting from observation, the physical world. He's painting his inside and moving that through. The same is true of Lee as well. Lee studied at the Art Students League. She also studied at Cooper Union in New York City, okay? This is unusual also. This is a birdhouse which Pollock made. He had a pet crow, and the crow's name was Caw-Caw. And they also had two dogs. They did not have children. So here is the barn studio, which is the highlight of coming into the historic site. because what we see here is Pollock's drip painted floor. This is not a work of art. This is the accidental spills and splatters. We can see where Pollock laid his canvas because, for example, right there, you can see the tracing, the rectangle of the white lines. And then you can even match it up and say, oh, okay, where would he made a painting of these colors? That is probably convergence. Now, I want to show you a photo of Pollock at work here. This is taken by Hans Namath, and it really shows his technique where he puts the painting on the floor and he says, I work from all four sides, similar to the Indian sand painters of the West. Now, Pollock had gone to the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, where he saw a show, and at that time they called it Indian art. The whole museum was filled with what they called Indian art. And Pollock saw the Navajo artists dribbling sand down and working from all four sides. And similarly, that is what Pollock did. He laid the painting on the floor and walked around the painting. He said, sometimes I even am in the painting. Now, there's a practical reason to lay it on the floor. Not only were some of the paintings large, but not all of them were large. Of course, gravity pulls the paint down. It stays put wherever it lands. When we look at a Pollock painting, we can actually trace his movement. And it's called action painting. Not only because Pollock is moving while he's painting, but also because the artist's action is very evident. Pollock wasn't the only action painter. Lee was an action painter as well, as was de Kooning and many other artists who fall under the category of abstract expressionism. But every artist in abstract expressionism creates art in his, her, or their own way, right? What they have in common is in this idea is, in most cases, it's 100% abstract, but also, as I said, it's this physical release of energy. Now, as you see here in the photo, here are Pollock's buckets of paint, and we have some of them actually here in the Barnes studio. Pollock is not using art paint. He's using house paint, right? Industrial, basically industrial paint. He's using a baster here to spray the paint. He's using the paint stirrer as a stick to drip the paint. And sometimes he would use the brush to drip the paint. Now, he didn't arrive at this technique overnight, right? Pollock gradually, if you look at his paintings, he moves away from Thomas Hart Benton in terms of style. He starts to move inward, as I said, and paints images that look somewhat mythological, even though they're not any specific myth. He starts to draw from his subconscious, his dreams, his emotions. Eventually, it gives way to abstract art, where there is no particular image, and also he's no longer using a brush. If he does use it, he's using it as a stick. But where did he get the idea? Didn't just come out of a vacuum. Pollock studied many of the artists before him. He studied the surrealists such as Miro, Roberto Mata. He studied Picasso, right? He studied the Mexican muralists such as Orozco, and in particular, Siqueiros. Siqueiros had a workshop in New York, as I mentioned before, and he was a great Mexican muralist. He used unusual techniques and materials. He used materials of our time, industrial materials, right? It was a rebellion against traditional methods and into a new era. And Siqueiros, and Martin, I know I'm not probably pronouncing it right. Our Spanish friend in Argentina, you want to unmute and tell us how to say Siqueiros, please?
Siqueiros.
Okay, I was close. Not the easiest Spanish name. But anyway, yeah, so he was teaching Pollock and the other people in the workshop how to spray paint from a spray gun or marbleize it or drip it. And Siqueiros was very interested in the idea of the accidental in art. And we see Pollock's work really changes while he's taking that workshop. It becomes much more experimental and expressive. But for Pollock, it was individual expression that he was interested in. Siqueiros was interested, it was more of a political rebellion. That was the underpinning of the drive for Siqueiros, not for Pollock. Pollock, it was really expressionism as an individual. And also, Pollock is doing 100% drip painting. Siqueiros, when he did his techniques, he would do dripping here and there, but not the entire painting. Anyway, so where was I with the story? Okay, so I'm doing an abbreviated story because we only have a half hour altogether. But that being said, let's start from the beginning of Lee and Pollock. So here we have historic photos on the wall. Lee and Pollock met in New York City. There was two stories of how they met. One was that they were at a dance and they danced together. And he was a sloppy dancer. He stepped on her foot, but Lee didn't usually tell that story because she didn't really remember him. She usually says that they met when they were in an exhibition together at Macmillan Gallery. She didn't know who he was. She saw his name on the list and she went to his studio and introduced herself. And she went unannounced and they, hit it off, so to speak. And moved in together eventually, moved out here. And when they moved out here, they got married. Now, Lee managed, and here's a picture of the house and the grounds. They moved out here in 1945, and they bought the property in 1946. How did they afford it? Lee negotiated with the patron, Peggy Guggenheim, a loan for the down payment of the house. Also negotiated with Peggy Guggenheim to give Pollock a monthly stipend so he could paint. Lee was the manager of Pollock's career and she was brilliant at it. She always painted while he was alive, but she didn't promote herself professionally while he was alive. She focused on his career. They decided as a couple, he would be the breadwinner, so to speak. This was not uncommon for women in general at that time in the 40s and 50s, right, to support their husband's efforts. So Pollock did have a problem. He was an alcoholic and he sought treatment and he was sober for 2 years. That's when he made his great drip paintings. And life was actually really good. Here's a picture with him and the crow. They had the 2 dogs. Financially, they were doing very well. You could say it's the American dream. This is 1952. They have a house, land, a car, and Pollock rises to fame. He is the front runner of abstract expressionism. This is Life magazine, 1949. Is he the greatest living painter in the United States? As Pollock rises to fame, certainly all the other artists rise to fame as well, and all of their prices go up. Now, sadly, Pollock succumbed to alcoholism. If you want to know the details of his alcoholism, I invite you to go to a YouTube video on my YouTube channel, which is Joyce Raimondo YouTube. And in a talk with Helen Harrison, the former director, we go into detail about Pollock's alcoholism and how it affected his life and his art. But let's just suffice to say, it did not help his art because when he relapsed, he became so severely depressed. He started an affair with a younger woman, Ruth Kligman, and he wasn't functioning. He eventually stopped painting because of that relapse. And then, of course, he got into a car, drinking and driving. He was behind the wheel with Ruth Kligman and her friend Edith Metzger. They were on their way to Alfonso Sorio's party. For reasons unknown, Pollock turned the car around to come back, and he crashed the car on Springs Fireplace Road, not too far from the National Landmark here. and he died along with Edith Metzger. Ruth survived. It's very tragic. He was 44 years old. And when he relapsed from his sobriety, he was at the peak of his fame. Now that was 1956. Lee was in Paris. She comes back. She didn't paint for a year, but then eventually she did come into the Barn studio and resume her painting. And we have this wonderful photo here by Hans Nahmet. This is 1962. And here we see Lee with the painting card I just showed you, with her paintings behind her. She's also, as I said, an action painter, but she did not paint on the floor. And we can see in the Barn studio here, you see her ghost marks up here? That's what we call them. You could see, oh, that's where she made this painting. And then you can match up the colors if you're familiar. You see that green all the way up there? Aha, this is where she made Portrait in Green, for example. And we have a photo of her right here by Mark Pataki of her painting Portrait in Green. And this is the exact spot. You could see the line there. That's where she would have painted Portrait in Green. So it's a lot of fun to come here and see the artist process. Now, why is it if Lee was in here, how is it that this is Pollock's floor? Where is the evidence of her paint? Well, this was all covered with boards. When they were alive, and I'll show you in the photo, see right here? The floor was covered with boards. They winterized it. It remained that way. And Lee painted in here until she was an older woman. And she arranged with Stony Brook University, that this would become a museum. After her death, the museum conservators came in here in 1987, and they lifted off the boards, lifted off the paper, and underneath they revealed Pollock's drip painted floor. You can imagine how astounded they were. Now, thanks to Lee and her foresight, this is now a national landmark run under the auspices of Stony Brook University. All that beautiful land that I showed you that leads to Accabonac Creek, that is a nature preserve donated by Lee. And what I am honestly, not only am I impressed of Lee, her character as a woman and as an artist, but I think this is one of the things I admire the most about Lee, is that she took the fortune that she inherited of Pollock's work and created an endowment. And it's called Pollock-Krasner Foundation, PKF. And it gives grants to artists and also to art organizations. So you can apply, you can learn more. It's separate from the museum, PK House, we're pkhouse.org, and that website is pkf.org. Okay. Over here, you'll see this is an outhouse. See that? When they moved into this house, it was an old dilapidated, rundown farmhouse. And they bought all this property, approximately 1.5 acres of property for $5,000. The whole character of the area was very different. It was truly rural. There were only 200 people in the entire town of the Springs, which is Springs, East Hampton, and they were mostly fishermen and farmers, and it was extremely quiet out here. So naturally, they renovated the house, they put bathrooms in, and they made it into a home. So what I would like to do is show you some of the art that actually was here when they lived here. And the whole house is renovated to when Lee was here, because she died after Pollock. However, some of the things were here, you'll see in photos, when they were both alive. But some of the items, such as this beautiful table over here, this came later. This was when Lee lived here. So a couple of interesting artworks. This is a tarpon fish that Lee's friend caught. and in the bay. And he put it right here on the counter, rolled ink onto the fish, and made a fish print, Japanese fish printing. This sculpture is by Lee's nephew, Ronald Stein, and it's made from found objects such as wood turnings and all sorts of different items. There's chess pieces here. There's army men. And way up at the top, there is a piece that looks like a crown, and water came out of there. So this was actually a water fountain, and it was displayed at Guildhall, our local museum, outdoors, where the museum invited artists to make water fountains, and Lee Krasner bought this from her nephew. You'll see a lot in modern art the idea of the found object. Today we call it recycling art, but back then they called it found objects. Because in modern life, isn't there so much debris? There's so much thrown out. There's so many mass-produced items. And artists take hold of that to repurpose it. And it also has the creative idea that you can see an object in more than one way, right? So take, for example, this anchor. They found this on the beach, but then when they hang it up, it's called ready-made art. You don't even have to do anything to it. You just say that's art. But we can see it in many ways, right? We could see it as an anchor. We could see it as a stick figure, as a crucifix, as a sword, as a bent letter T, as the children say, right? So sometimes modern art plays with our perception, the idea of how we imagine, how we perceive, how we even interpret. And here is a photo of Lee and Pollock standing right next to the anchor in 1950. Now, what I love also is when we come in here and we see their books, and up here is an encyclopedic volume of indigenous people's art from around the world. And Pollock studied indigenous people's art. As Theresa said, he grew up in the West, so he was exposed to art by Navajo, and that was a major influence in his paintings, actually, and in his methodology. Down here, we see Pollock's record collection. Normally, we have the record player. I'm not sure where it is right now, but here's his records. Pollock listened to jazz, and Lee said it drove her crazy. He listens to jazz day and night. Now, when Pollock painted, he was not listening to music, but jazz was a really major influence in Pollock's art as well as many of the modern artists. Why? Because jazz is improvisational. There's a structure, and the musicians have a mastery over the music and the instrument. But within their mastery, they're not just following a script, a score, right? They're improvising. They're making it up as they go along. They're playing off one another. Similarly, Pollock is improvising when he's painting. He says the painting has a life of its own. I let it lead, right? One mark leads to the next. This is you see this in many, many artists in general, but in particular in modern painters. And sometimes you'll see titles in Pollock's paintings, but he didn't start off with a title or a subject in mind. He started, and when he did title his painting, he often just called it number 1, number 2. And then later on, friends suggested that he make titles, and sometimes they would give him suggestions. But anyway, I'm upstairs now. This is the guest room. And these 2 beds were originally their marital beds, which were in the main bedroom, which I'm about to show you. And these crocheted bedspreads were made by Pollock's mother, Stella, who was really an incredible craftsperson herself. And here is the bedroom, which of course later on was Lee's room. So we see many of Lee's belongings. This is a portrait of Lee by Igor Pontonov, her boyfriend before she was married. Her shell collection, Lee had a love of nature, and the nature theme appears in many of her abstract paintings. It's suggested rather than copied. She has inspiration from nature rather than copying. This is a print by Lee, and you can see what I mean in here. It has like a feeling of water or leaves, something springing forth, right? But it's not literal. And this small room, the very first year, Pollock worked here until the summer of 1946, and then Lee painted in this small room. And here's another portrait of Lee by Igor Pantahov. And this is my favorite part. Look at this beautiful view. Can you see that? Spectacular. We do have many different types of virtual and in-person programs. So right now we have our family workshops are up and running for the summer. We have music programs and lectures on site and in other locations. We also, so you could go to pkhouse.org, and we also have many, many virtual programs, and some of them are hands-on programs, which many of you know we actually make art, which is a lot of fun. Anyway, everybody, have a wonderful day, evening, or afternoon, wherever you are. So thank you so much.